Hi, just a quick reminder that this podcast has merch, a Patreon, a Fiverr gig, and some affiliated links. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. Alright, now enjoy the show. I need to give a content warning before we start this episode. In this episode, there is violence mentioned, so listener discretion is advised. A boy raised in the shadows of his older siblings managed to prove himself. He became a man full of political ambition and the urge to do what he thought was right, including fighting for civil rights and the underprivileged. But tragedy would strike, shaping his future, his family, and American history. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 15th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. Welcome to season 5 of History Shelf. This season is titled History, Taylor's Version. That is because these 14 people that I will be covering this season all have one thing in common. The one thing they have in common is they all have been name dropped in a Taylor Swift song. Now, don't stop listening if you're not a fellow Swiftie like me. This season is not going to be about Taylor Swift. You don't have to be a Swiftie to enjoy this season. You just have to be a history lover. So please, stay. What we are going to do is you and I are going to go on a little adventure that spans 2,404 years. Who I am going to cover this season are fearless leaders, people from the screen, poets straight from the Tortured Poets Department, and people who were just trying to find a place in this world. Some of these stories may be stories of happiness. They may be sad, beautiful, tragic. But long story short, I hope that you will be enchanted to get to know the stories of these historical figures all too well. So, are you ready for it? For this week, I am talking about Robert F. Kennedy Sr. one more time. This is part 2 of Robert F. Kennedy Sr.'s story. So there was part 1, and I recommend that you listen to part 1 before you listen to this episode, because it'll just be easier to follow along with the story. But you don't have to if you don't want to. I have a recap, and I won't be able to tell you everything that happened in last week's episode, but I will give you the highlights. So, Robert Francis Kennedy was born into an upper-class family that had a deep interest in politics. Robert was number 7 in a family of 9 children. He was determined to prove himself. He was a devout Catholic. He married a woman named Ethel Skakel. They had 11 children together. Robert and Ethel had a great marriage, but Robert probably had a few affairs. Robert went to law school, and he was barred in Massachusetts. Robert's brother, John, was the 35th President of the United States. Robert became the U.S. Attorney General during his brother's administration. He had a big focus on organized crime and civil rights when he was the U.S. Attorney General. And that is a recap of the first episode. And I told you last week that I was going to start this episode by telling you about Robert F. Kennedy Sr.'s relationship with Marilyn Monroe. So that's what I'm going to get started on now. I said last week that Robert was unfaithful to his wife Ethel. One affair that Robert probably had was an affair with the actress and Hollywood icon Marilyn Monroe. There is a good chance that you probably have already heard about the alleged affair that Marilyn had with Robert's brother John, but I feel that Marilyn's alleged affair with Robert is not as well known, but it is a possibility that it happened. In 2016, there was a letter and some other things that used to belong to Marilyn that went up for auction. The letter was allegedly written by Robert's sister, Jean. The letter says, quote, "Understand that you and Bobby are the new item. We all think you should come with him when he comes back east." End quote. Even before this letter was made known, there was speculation that Robert and Marilyn had had an affair. Marilyn died on August 5th, 1962, of a barbiturate overdose. It was ruled a probable suicide, but some never have accepted the official ruling. Some have speculated that Marilyn's affairs with Robert and John may have played a role in her death. We know for a fact that Marilyn knew both of the Kennedys. They both had apparently cut ties with Marilyn the summer before she died. That was the summer that the possibility of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union was a real possibility. Marilyn was said to have talked to both of the men about nuclear war, something that Marilyn thought was wrong. There was fear that the Kennedy men may have had loose lips and told Marilyn some nuclear secrets that they shouldn't have, and she may have got the idea to share those secrets with her left-leaning friends. Those friends were seen as communists, and they had been talking to Fidel Castro. Investigative journalist Anthony Summers claims that Marilyn didn't die in her bed naked on August 5th, 1962, but rather she died in an ambulance on August 4th, 1962. And after she died, she was taken back to her home and put in her bed. Now, I cannot stress this enough that none of this has been proven. There are some that believe that Marilyn Monroe was murdered, and there's been no hard proof of that. It has not been proven that Marilyn Monroe was murdered and that that murder had anything to do with any of the Kennedys. Marilyn's biographer, James Spada, said that he doesn't believe there is any proof that the Kennedys were responsible for Marilyn's death, but he did say that it is pretty clear that Marilyn had a sexual relationship with both Robert and John. One thing that Robert did when he was Attorney General was he went after U.S. Steel. John told Robert to use the power of federal agencies to influence U.S. Steel not to institute a price increase. Robert announced a grand jury probe to investigate possible collusion and price fixing by U.S. Steel in collaboration with other major steel manufacturers. Robert received criticism for this. The Wall Street Journal wrote that the administration had set prices of steel, quote, by naked power, by threats, by agents of the state security police, end quote. The left-wing magazine The New Republic wrote that the Justice Department had violated civil liberties by calling a federal grand jury to indict U.S. Steel so quickly, then disbanding it after the price increase did not occur. The Cold War was a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. It started in 1947 and it ended in 1991. So after World War II, Berlin was divided into West and East Berlin. The Allies had divided Germany. West Germany was controlled by the United States, France, and Great Britain. East Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union. I told you last week about the blockade of Berlin. After the blockade was lifted in 1949, things went back to the way they were. Each ally governed its own sector and had access to all the other sectors. On November 10, 1958, the Soviet Union demanded that the United States and its allies relinquish their occupation roles in Berlin. The Soviet Union said that if they did not sign an agreement agreeing to this within 6 months, then the Soviet Union would no longer honor their post-war agreement, and they would enter into a separate treaty with East Germany. Dwight D. Eisenhower refused the demands when he was president. So, on November 27th, the Soviet Union announced that it had rejected the post war agreements concerning the occupation and governance of Germany and West Berlin. Nikita Khrushchev also wanted Berlin to become a free city. Nikita didn't come out and say that the Soviet Union would use military force if the United States did not comply, but it was just understood that they would. Both the United States and Britain did not give in to the demands. They believed that if Berlin was free with no guaranteed access to the West, then it would soon be controlled by communist East Germany. Any attempts at a diplomatic solution were unsuccessful. Remember that summit I talked about last week? The one with John and Nikita? The one that Robert thought was going to be hurt by the race riots? Well, at that summit in June of 1961, Nikita brought up his threat again. He said if a Berlin Agreement was not achieved by December, then the Soviet Union would sign a separate treaty with East Germany. John made it clear that the United States had to maintain free access to Berlin. In July of 1961, every day there were about 1,000 East German refugees that were crossing into West Berlin. That would for sure have led to bad things for East Germany's economy. So, in the night of August 12th, 1961, going into August 13th, the East German government, backed by the Soviet Union, began building a wall between East Berlin and West Berlin. The United States did nothing because the Soviet Union was exercising control over its sector. The December 1961 deadline came and went, and the Soviet Union did nothing. Robert had a crucial role during this time. He was in contact in private with an intelligence officer from the Soviet Union named Georgy Bolshakov, and they relayed important diplomatic information to each other. That is how the Vienna summit in June of 1961 was set up. There was also a tank standoff with American and Soviet Union tanks at the Berlin Wall during the Berlin crisis of 1961, known as Checkpoint Charlie. Robert was able to use his connection with Georgy to defuse the situation. Germany wasn't the only country that Robert helped the Kennedy administration with. He also helped his brother with Cuba. Robert oversaw the CIA's anti-Castro activities after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. You may remember me talking about the Bay of Pigs invasion in one of the Eleanor Roosevelt episodes. But if you don't remember, or if you haven't listened to those episodes, the Bay of Pigs invasion took place in 1961, and it was a failed attack launched by the CIA to push Fidel Castro from power. The United States was outnumbered, and the invasion failed. Robert also helped out with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, the Soviet Union made a promise in May of 1960 to defend Cuba with Soviet arms. So, the Soviet Union gave Cuba medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles. These missiles could hit much of the eastern United States within a few minutes. The United States learned in July of 1962 that the Soviet Union had begun to ship missiles to Cuba. U-2 spy planes flew over Cuba, and on October 14th, the presence of a ballistic missile on a launching site was reported. So, John decided to place a naval blockade on Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments of missiles. The blockade was announced on October 22nd and warned that United States forces would seize offensive weapons and associated material that Soviet vessels might attempt to deliver to Cuba. Eventually, things worked out. On October 28th, the Soviet Union said that they would take back their missiles and they wouldn't give Cuba any more. The United States said that they wouldn't invade Cuba and they would withdraw the nuclear armed missiles that the United States had stationed in Turkey. Both sides kept their promises, and the crisis was over by late November. Robert helped develop the strategy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He helped develop the blockade plan instead of doing a military strike because he was afraid that that would lead to nuclear war. On October 27th, Robert had met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin in secret, and they reached the decision that the Soviet Union would withdraw their missiles from Cuba and that the United States would not invade Cuba and that they would also withdraw their missiles from Turkey. It has been debated for decades if the Kennedys had plans to kill Fidel Castro. In 2007, the CIA declassified the family jewels documents that suggested that before the Bay of Pigs invasion, Robert had personally authorized an assassination attempt on Fidel. But there is some evidence to the contrary that he wanted him killed. Robert had been informed of an assassination plot involving the CIA's use of mafia bosses Sam Giancana and John Rosalie, and he directed the CIA to halt existing efforts directed at Fidel's assassination. Robert also helped the relations between the United States and Japan. The relations between the United States and Japan were delicate in February of 1962 when John sent Robert to Japan. There were protests in Japan against the United States Japan Security Treaty, but Robert's charismatic personality won over the Japanese public. November 22nd, 1963 was a day that not only changed Robert and the Kennedy family's lives, but it also changed America. John was getting ready to run for re-election. He made plans to visit the states of Florida and Texas. On November 21st, John and his wife Jackie left for Texas. They were in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd. Both John and Jackie sat in an open convertible in the motorcade. With them was the governor of Texas, John Connally, and his wife Nellie. At around 12:30 p.m., their car turned off Main Street at Dealey Plaza. As it was passing the Texas School Book Depository, shots rang out. Bullets struck John's neck and head, and he slumped over toward Jackie. Governor John Connally was also shot in the back. The car quickly sped off to Parkland Memorial Hospital that was just a few minutes away, but there was nothing any doctor would have been able to do to save John's life. He was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. He was 46 years old. The governor was able to recover. It wouldn't even take police an hour to arrest Lee Harvey Oswald for the assassination of John and for shooting and killing patrolman J.D. Tippit shortly afterward. If you are looking for a definite answer as to why Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy, you won't find it here. I can only provide you with speculation. Lee was discharged from the military, and when he defected to Russia in October of 1959. This was reported by the Associated Press. Lee returned to the United States in June of 1962, but he was disappointed when his return to the United States received no media attention. Lee was also pro-Fidel Castro, so he could have been afraid that John was going to kill Fidel. He also could have done it for attention. He may have been trying to make up for the lack of attention he received as a child. The reason why I can only offer you speculation is because Lee never said why he did it, and no one can ask him because on November 24th, 1963, Lee was being transferred from police headquarters to the county jail. While this was happening, a man named Jack Ruby pulled out a pistol, took his aim, and fired at point blank range, shooting Lee on live television. Lee was taken to the same hospital that John was, and 2 hours later, he was pronounced dead. He was 24 years old. Now, if you don't know how the United States government works, if a president dies before they leave office, then the vice president becomes the president. So Lyndon B. Johnson was now the president. Robert was home when his brother was killed. J. Edgar Hoover called him to inform him that John had been shot. Robert later said that he thought that J. Edgar Hoover enjoyed calling him to tell him that. After he got off the phone, Robert made a call to the United States National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy. He told McGeorge to change the locks on the president's files. He told the Secret Service to dismantle the hidden taping system in the Oval Office and cabinet room. Robert also scheduled a meeting with CIA Director John McCone. He asked John if the CIA had anything to do with his brother's death. John told Robert that the CIA had nothing to do with the assassination. Robert would go on later to tell investigator Walter Sheridan that he asked the director if the CIA had anything to do with his brother's death, quote, in a way that he couldn't lie to me, end quote. Robert and Lyndon B. Johnson came to the conclusion that Lyndon should take the oath of office before returning to Washington. At first, Robert wasn't okay with that, but then he came around to it and thought that it was for the best. Robert also disagreed with Jackie Kennedy that John's casket should be closed, but he changed his mind when he saw the state of John's body. I'm not going to go into details here. You can look up information about John's body on your own, but I will say that it was gruesome. I cannot imagine what Jackie Kennedy went through that day. Publicly, Robert said that he believed the president's commission on the assassination of President Kennedy, also known as the Warren Commission. And he believed that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in killing his brother. But historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. met with Robert in 1966, and this is what he wrote, quote, "It is evident that he believes that the Warren Commission's report was a poor job and will not endorse it, but that he is unwilling to criticize it and thereby reopen the whole tragic business," end quote. The journalist, painter, and chairman of U.S. Commission of Fine Art William Walton was sent to the Soviet Union by Robert days after John's assassination. There, William met with Russian diplomat Georgy Bolshakov, and he delivered a message to him. He wanted to let Georgy know that both Robert and Jackie believed there was a conspiracy involved in killing John. He also let Georgy know that Robert wanted peace with the Soviet Union, and so did John. Now, I am not saying there was a conspiracy or there wasn't. I honestly do not know. I am just telling you what others believed. Following John's death, Robert grew close to Jackie. They both found comfort in each other. This started rumors that Robert and Jackie were having an affair. Robert took a vacation with Jackie, Jackie's sister Lee, Lee's husband Stas Roswell, and one of John's college friends, Charles Spaulding. On this vacation, everyone was in a horrible state and they were grieving. On this vacation, it was reported that Robert and Jackie read Greek literature to each other, took long walks, and held hands on the beach. Now, allegedly, Ethel did not believe the rumors that Robert and Jackie were having an affair. Did Robert and Jackie have a physical affair? Did they have an emotional affair? Or was a heartbroken brother and a heartbroken widow just finding friendship in each other because they both understood each other's pain? We don't know. We probably will never know. So now that the vice president was now the president, he needed a vice president. The obvious pick, the pick that so many wanted, was Robert. I say that so many wanted Robert as the vice president, but I didn't say that everyone wanted him to be the VP. Lyndon B. Johnson did not want Robert. I told you last week that they did not like each other, but it wasn't just that made Lyndon uninterested in having Robert as his vice president. Lyndon had been the vice president to one Kennedy, and he didn't want to have another Kennedy be his VP. He didn't want to be in the shadows of the Kennedys. He wanted to be reelected, but he wanted to be reelected because America wanted him and not another Kennedy. This is what Johnson's staffers called the Bobby problem. A Gallup poll revealed in April of 1964 that 47% of Democrats wanted Robert as the vice president. There was a draft movement in the New Hampshire primary. When this happens in American politics, it is to encourage or put pressure on someone to enter the political race. The governor of New Hampshire, John W. King, endorsed this movement. This pissed Lyndon off. During the New Hampshire primary, Robert received 25,094 write-in votes for vice president. Republicans picked Barry Goldwater as their presidential nominee. This made things easier for Lyndon. He knew that he could easily beat Barry. So he didn't have to pick Robert, and he didn't. Instead, he picked Hubert Humphrey as his running mate. Lyndon and his wife Claudia, better known as Lady Bird, both received angry letters when Lyndon made a statement that none of the current cabinet members would be his vice president pick. During the Democratic National Convention, Hubert Humphrey hadn't been confirmed as Lyndon's running mate. Lyndon had fear that the delegates were going to draft the brother of the late John F. Kennedy onto the ticket as his vice president. So Lyndon ordered the FBI to monitor Robert's contacts and actions at the convention. He didn't want Robert talking to Hubert until it was confirmed that Hubert would be on the ticket with him. Robert showed a short film called 1,000 Days on the last day of the convention. The short film was to honor John's memory. Robert appeared on the convention floor and he was met with 22 minutes of uninterrupted applause from the delegates, causing Robert to get emotional and almost breaking into tears. What Robert's future was going to look like was uncertain. In June of 1964, he offered to become the U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam. Lyndon did not like that idea and he turned down the offer. There was a moment where Robert thought that American politics was no longer for him. After Robert's brother, Edward, also known as Ted, was in a plane crash, he survived. Robert told a reporter, quote, "The Kennedys intend to stay in public life. Good luck is something you make, and bad luck is something you endure," end quote. Ted's plane crash had to be tough for Robert. The plane crash was just 7 months after John's assassination. And remember, Robert's oldest brother, Joseph Jr., died in a plane crash. And his sister, Kathleen, also died in a plane crash on May 13th, 1948. When Robert went to Germany and Poland for 6 days, he received a positive reception. Robert knew then that he wanted to stay in politics. But he didn't know right away what the best path was for him. Should he run for governor of Massachusetts or should he run for senator of New York? He wanted the option that would make it the easiest for him to become president in the future. So Robert asked the advisor Milton Gounsman to compare the two offices. Massachusetts was in debt and had unruly legislature. And Robert was John F. Kennedy's brother, so he was going to be asked to speak all around the world. And it would be so much easier to do that as a senator than as a governor. So Robert set his eyes on the Senate. Jackie supported Robert running for the Senate, but she did not want him to run for president. Robert announced on August 25th, 1964, that he was going to run to be a senator of New York. The reason why he picked New York and not Massachusetts was because his brother, Ted, was running for re-election in Massachusetts. Robert resigned as Attorney General on September 2nd, 1964. And Lyndon gave Robert his support for the Senate race. Now, a lot of people liked Robert, but some were bothered by the fact that someone from Massachusetts was running to be a senator in New York. The New York Times said, quote, "There is nothing illegal about the possible nomination of Robert F. Kennedy of Massachusetts as senator from New York, but there is plenty of cynical about it. Merely choosing the state as a convenient launching pad for the political ambition of himself," end quote. Robert was running against Republican incumbent Kenneth Keating. Kenneth accused Robert of being a carpetbagger. Now, what the hell is a carpetbagger? A carpetbagger is when a candidate runs in a state that they do not live in and have little connection to. Ethel came up with Robert's slogan, quote, "There is only so much you can do for Massachusetts," end quote. Kenneth wasn't the only New Yorker that was bothered by a Massachusetts native running in New York. Large crowds of people had signs that said, "Bobby, go home," and "Go back to Massachusetts." But even with all of that, Robert won the election. He won the election by 719,000 votes. Going from Attorney General to Senator was a big change for Robert. He no longer had as much power since he was no longer the president's main advisor, but he took his job seriously. He earned a reputation for being well prepared for debates and speaking his mind to his fellow senators. The latter didn't always earn him friends in the Senate, though he did become BFFs with Oklahomian Senator Fred R. Harris. This next little bit I didn't really know where to put into this episode because it's just a little fact, but I thought it was interesting and chronologically it fits here. So on March 24th, 1965, Robert reached the summit of Mount Kennedy. It was 13,000 feet. Up to that point, it was the highest unclimbed peak in North America. The mountain was named after John F. Kennedy on January 4th, 1965. Robert was passionate about gun control, underprivileged children, and students with disabilities. In May of 1965, he co-sponsored putting federal restrictions on mail-ordered gun sales. He improved living conditions and employment opportunities in depressed areas in Brooklyn. He wanted more Americans to know about the struggles that lower-income Americans faced. He wanted to remedy the problems of poverty with legislation. He encouraged private industry to locate in poverty-stricken areas, thus creating jobs for the unemployed, and he stressed work over welfare. Robert also cared about human rights. He wanted the Catholic Church to be more progressive. He visited Pope Paul VI in 1966, and he urged him to address the misery and poverty in South Africa's black population. In 1967, he asked that pope to adopt more liberal rhetoric and extend the church's appeal to Hispanics and other nationalities. Robert traveled to Eastern Europe, Latin America, and South Africa to share his belief that all people should have the basic human right to be able to participate in political decisions that affect them, and to be able to criticize their government without fear of reprisal. He believed that those that acted out against injustice showed the highest form of courage. Proposed funding for drug treatment and reform in the financing of Social Security. He succeeded in amending the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that protected non English speakers from unfair imposition of English language literacy tests and added an evaluation requirement to the new federal program to help educationally disadvantaged children. Robert was a supporter of the Great Society, and what that was a set of domestic programs that Lyndon B. Johnson initiated to eliminate poverty and racial injustice in America. Spoiler alert, they still exist in America. On February 8th, 1966, Robert urged the United States to pledge that it would not be the first country to use nuclear weapons against countries that did not have them. The Dominican Republic had a civil war between April 24th, 1965 and September 3rd, 1965. Juan Emilio Bosch Gavino was elected president of the Dominican Republic. Months after his inauguration, he was ousted from the government by the Dominican military. Lyndon B. Johnson sent troops to the Dominican Republic to stop the spread of communism. Robert criticized this move. Robert also wanted to end the war between the United States and Vietnam. He called for the halt of U.S. bombing in Vietnam on March 2nd, 1967. Robert toured Native American reservations and he was angry over the deplorable conditions. So he created a Senate subcommittee on Indian education. He served as its chairman. He said that the treatment of Native Americans was a national disgrace. Robert also worked on the Senate Labor Committee. He was against the death penalty. He sent letters to his constituents throughout 1968, and he expressed his strong willingness to support a bill then under consideration for the abolishment of the death penalty. While on the campaign trail, Robert continued to speak out against the Vietnam War. He said that the Vietnam War was, quote, the gravest kind of error, end quote. The Vietnam War wasn't the only reason Robert decided to run. Writer Pete Hamill sent Robert a letter telling him that poor people kept pictures of John F. Kennedy on their walls, and he told him that he had to stay true to whatever it was that put those pictures on those walls. Robert was also concerned with the violence that racism was causing in the country, and Robert felt that Lyndon wasn't doing anything about it. Robert met with civil rights activist Cesar Chavez in California, and his trip to California was what made him decide to run for president against Lyndon. Not only was he running against Lyndon, but he was also running against Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy. Ted Kennedy thought that it would be a bad idea for Robert to go up against Lyndon. He felt that he didn't have a chance to defeat him, and he felt that losing would hurt Robert's future chances at becoming president. But Robert declared his candidacy on March 16, 1968. Eugene McCarthy's supporters called him an opportunist. On April 4th, 1968, the civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. This caused Robert to give a heartfelt, impromptu speech in Indianapolis. He called for reconciliation between the races. Riots broke out in 60 cities because of Martin's death, but Indianapolis was not one of them. Many said that Robert's speech was the reason. Robert went to Martin's funeral, and he was described as being the only white politician to hear only cheers and applause. Robert won the primary in Indiana and in Nebraska, but he lost the Oregon primary. He was the first Kennedy to lose an election, but he could turn it all around during the California primary. He just had to knock Eugene McCarthy out of the race. Robert was among a cheering crowd in San Francisco's Chinatown on June 3rd. Shots rang out, but the sound would turn out just to be firecrackers. Robert did win the California primary, and he also won the South Dakota primary, both on June 4th. He now had 393 delegates against Hubert Humphrey's 561. Robert got the election news around midnight on June 5th. After he got the news, he went to address his supporters in a ballroom at the hotel he was staying at, the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, California. He gave his speech, and then he left the ballroom. He went through the kitchen because he was told that it was a shortcut to a press room. He did this even though his bodyguard had advised him not to do that. He shook hands with his supporters and hotel staff in a crowded passageway. That was when it happened. That was when a man stepped out in front of Robert holding a .22 caliber revolver. That man was later identified as Sirhan Sirhan. Sirhan fired the gun at Robert and his entourage. He hit Robert in his head and body, and he also wounded 5 others. People tried to disarm Sirhan. Sirhan broke free and tried to grab the gun again, but others grabbed him. Robert laid on the floor and asked the busboy Juan Romero if everyone was okay. Juan told Robert that everyone was okay. Robert was lifted onto a stretcher when medical attendants arrived. Robert told them, quote, "Don't lift me," end quote. Those were Robert's last words. He lost consciousness shortly after that. He was taken to the Good Samaritan Hospital. He died there the next day on June 6, 1968. He was 42 years old. Ethel was 3 months pregnant when Robert was assassinated. So Robert and his daughter Rory never got to meet each other. And that's why I think in Taylor Swift's song Starlight, she wrote that they could have 10 kids. I think she wrote it that way because Robert and Ethel only got to raise 10 out of their 11 children together. And if you think back to the Malcolm X episode that I did last season, that's what happened to Malcolm. When Malcolm was assassinated, his wife was pregnant with their twin daughters, so he never got to meet them. Robert's body was taken back to Manhattan, New York. It lay in repose at St. Patrick's Cathedral. His body was then taken to Washington, D.C. by a private train. Thousands of mourners lined the tracks and stations along the route. This trip usually took about 4 hours, but because of the mourners, it took 8. Robert was buried close to his brother John at Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia. Robert said that he wanted to be buried in Massachusetts, but his family thought that he should be near John. The funeral was held at 10:30 p.m. After Robert's assassination, Congress mandated that the United States presidential candidates were to be protected by the U.S. Secret Service. But what happened to Sirhan Sirhan, and why did he do it? Well, Sirhan Sirhan was born in Jerusalem, Palestine. He witnessed the 1948 Palestine War before his parents moved to California. Sirhan was unhappy about the move. He said that America was against Arabs and was friendly with Israel, and a friend of his enemy was his enemy. He was very anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian. That was why he said that he killed Robert, because of Robert's pro-Israeli sympathies. He wrote in his diary on May 18th, 1968, quote, "Robert Kennedy must be assassinated. My determination to eliminate RFK is becoming more and more of an unshakable obsession. RFK must die. RFK must be killed," end quote. Sirhan was not a citizen of the United States, so it was illegal for him to buy a gun under California law. Sirhan went to trial for Robert's assassination, and on April 17, 1969, he was found guilty. He was sentenced to the death penalty, but he was given life in 1972 when California abolished the death penalty. Sirhan has claimed that he is unable to remember the shooting. He has said that he was intoxicated at the time of the shooting, though he did admit during his trial that he was guilty, but he said that his statements were the result of his defense attorneys making him think that he was guilty. Now, just like with John's, Robert's assassination has created conspiracy theories. Some believe that there was a second gunman. On an audio tape of the shooting, 13 shots are reportedly heard, though Sirhan's gun only had 8 rounds. At Sirhan's 2016 parole hearing, one of the people that was wounded in the attack testified that a different gunman had shot Robert. This did not move the parole board to grant Sirhan parole. In 2021, he was up for parole for the 16th time. Now the parole board had to consider age, health, and other factors due to recent reforms. It was recommended that Sirhan be freed, but California Governor Gavin Newsom denied his parole in 2022. I'm recording this episode in 2024. Sirhan is 80 years old, and he is still in prison. And I have a pretty good feeling that is where he's going to stay for the rest of his life. Some of those conspiracy theories say that the second gunman was a hotel security guard. A campaign worker, Sandra Serrano, said that she saw a woman in a polka dot dress in the hotel with Sirhan and another man. Sandra heard noises that she thought was a car backfire. She then heard the woman yell, quote, "We shot him, end quote. Sandra asked who, and the woman replied, "Senator Kennedy." Others say that they also saw the woman and man, and an elderly couple also said that they were shouting that they were the ones that shot Robert. Some believe that the CIA was involved. There is even a really far out there theory that Sirhan was psychologically programmed to kill Robert, and he was not aware of his actions, and then conspirators wiped his mind afterwards. In 2010, Sirhan's lawyers accused the CIA of hypnotizing Sirhan and making him an involuntary participant. Again, these are just conspiracy theories. I am not saying that any of these are true. Robert's biographer, Evan Thomas, said that even though he misused his powers, Robert was still a great attorney general. Journalist Walter Isaacson said that Robert was the best attorney general in history. The New York Times praised Robert for raising the standards of the position in September of 1964, even though 3 years prior they had criticized his appointment. Attorney General Eric Holder cited Robert as the inspiration for his belief that the Justice Department could be, quote, "a force for that which is right," end quote. Robert has been called a man that spoke his mind, fought for minorities and the disenfranchised. Joseph A. Palermo of the Huffington Post said that Robert's words, quote, could cut through social boundaries and partisan divides in a way that seems nearly impossible today, end quote. Liberals and conservatives alike have praised Robert's legacy, and I can tell you as an American, that is super rare to find something that liberals and conservatives agree on in America. Robert's idea of helping the less fortunate has become central to American liberalism. And if you're wondering, the Democrats lost the 1968 presidential election. Richard Nixon became the next president, and Robert's death played a role in that loss. In 1969, the District of Columbia Stadium in Washington, D.C. was renamed Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium. President George W. Bush and Attorney General John Ashcroft dedicated the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Justice as the Robert F. Kennedy Department of Justice Building on November 20th, 2001. On June 4th, 2008, the Triborough Bridge in New York City was renamed Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Bridge. The Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights was founded in 1968 with an international award program to recognize human rights activists. A small group of private citizens wanted to continue Robert's work, so they launched the Robert F. Kennedy Children's Action Corps in 1969. This nonprofit helps more than 800 abused and neglected children each year. Robert was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal for Distinguished Service by the U.S. Congress in 1978. You can find personal items and documents from his office in the Justice Department building on display in a permanent exhibit dedicated to him at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. The former Woodrow Wilson Jr. College was renamed Kennedy King College in 1969 after Robert and Martha Luther King Jr. The landmark for Peace Memorial honors both Robert and Martin. In 2019, Robert's speech that he gave after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. was selected by the Library of Congress for preservation in the National Recording Registry for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. So many documentaries have been made about Robert, but he has also shown up in other forms of media, like the TV play The Missiles of October, the films 13 Days, Bobby, Jackie, and The Irishman, and in the miniseries The Kennedys. His assassination is also mentioned in the movie Forrest Gump, and he is mentioned in Taylor Swift's song Starlight. It is track 15 off of her 4th studio album, Red. And that was the life of Robert F. Kennedy Sr. Thank you so much for listening to the 15th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf. Next week's episode is going to be about Robert Bly. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Instagram is at history_shelf_pod. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give you a shout out on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you'll get a handwritten note of thanks mail to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the Zippo pudding. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you take out ad space on this podcast. Also, if you click on one of the affiliated links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. There's one for Riverside, there's one for Amazon, and there's one for Bookshop. But if you don't want any of the perks or any of the merch and you don't want to buy anything but you still want to help support the podcast, I turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is just to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.